fuel from Gaza's hospitals. On the one hand, you're saying that there is no fuel, but on the other, we know it as a fact, and this is coming from the Israeli defense spokesperson, that Hamas is in fact stealing fuel from various hospitals. Now, according to the Gaza's health ministry, the death toll in Gaza has risen to 9,227. More than 3,700 of these are children. At the same time, the Hezbollah chief has addressed the public for the first time ever since the clash broke out, and the Hezbollah chief Nasrallah says the world has forgotten Palestine. Meanwhile, Antony Blinken, he is in Tel Aviv for the third time in the recent past, and Blinken has come out and said that we need to do more to protect the civilians in Gaza. The United States' focus on minimizing civilian casualty is something that has now come to the fore. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he met and spoke with the UAE's leader, and he's urged the Israel-Palestine authorities to find an early resolution into this particular conflict. Meanwhile, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Lebanese Shia terrorist group Hezbollah, spoke for the first time about the war in Gaza since Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October. He did not reveal the group's next move, but went on to say a couple of things. Now, meanwhile, Hezbollah's chief on Israel and Gaza war had a couple of major revelations to make. He says the world has forgotten Palestine, and he's also gone on to say that the weakness of Israel was exposed in that October 7th attack. Now, he's also gone on to say that the October 7th attack was planned solely by Hamas, and none of the allies of Hamas had any idea about this particular attack. He's also gone on to say that he thanks the Iraqi and the Yemeni hands that have supported Hamas in this particular conflict. This is the first speech by the Hezbollah chief ever since the clashes broke out. Meanwhile, Hezbollah is a Hamas ally that has been backed by Iran, and Nasrallah's address has come amid the fighting on the Lebanon-Israel border as well. So far, Hamas and Israel have been engaged in a contained battle for control, but Nasrallah is largely viewed to have the power to escalate the situation into a second war on Gaza's northern border. Now, Hezbollah, just like Hamas, is considered a terrorist organization by most countries, including those in the West and India as well. Hezbollah chief Nasrallah's first public speech. A lot of people that have gathered to either watch it virtually, get connected with that particular speech. A lot of people in Yemen that have come out to listen to the Hezbollah chief as well. Meanwhile, IDF spokesperson Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari has confirmed that Israel is on very high alert along its northern border. The military stands prepared to respond to any incidents that occur along the border, both today and in the upcoming days. Now, the increased alertness comes in response to a potentially heightened security situation in the region. Yesterday, we conducted a wide attack and struck a number of Hezbollah terror cells in response to a massive fire by Hezbollah towards Kiryan Shmona and Sfat that injured civilians. We will continue to respond harshly against any attack on Israeli civilians. We are on high preparedness in the north border, on very high alert to respond to any event today and in the coming days. Meanwhile, Israel Defense Forces continued to release videos of their ground forces operating in Gaza and the attacks on the Palestinian enclave by air and by sea. The IDF said that they had killed Hamas commander Mustafa Dalul during one of their aerial assaults. He added that they recovered weapons including AK-47 rifles, submachine guns, communication equipment and maps during searches in the Beit Hanun area. Israel said it has surrounded Gaza City, whilst the United States' top diplomat Antony Blinken, well, he was in Tel Aviv today seeking humanitarian pauses in the war to minimize harm to civilians in the besieged Gaza Strip, where food, fuel, water and medicine are scarce. But the prime aspect here is that Israeli Defense Forces have said that they have killed Hamas commander Mustafa Dalul during one of their aerial assaults. On the other hand, the IDF statement has come out and it has said that Israeli forces have, quote-unquote, completed the encirclement of Gaza City, unquote, and are fighting with full force. The Chief of Staff of the IDF, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, said troops are surrounding Gaza from several directions and deepening the ground offensive inside the city. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israeli forces had pushed through the outskirts of Gaza City, making their way towards the center. Now, Halavi has come out and said that the encirclement is almost complete. Meanwhile, blasts were heard and plumes of smoke were seen in Gaza from southern Israel on Friday, as Israel said its troops had surrounded the Palestinian enclave's biggest city, the focus of its drive to wipe out Hamas. Now, Israeli forces again pounded the Gaza Strip from ground, sea and air throughout the night amid global alarm over horrendous conditions inside the besieged territory and rising number of deaths of Palestinian civilians. Allied terrorist groups, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, said their fighters had detonated explosive devices against advancing troops, dropped grenades from drones, and fired mortars and anti-tank rockets in fierce urban warfare around the destroyed buildings.
Said before,
But on the other hand, casualties in the IDF. The IDF announced another 4 soldiers that have been killed fighting in the Gaza Strip, bringing the death toll since Israel began its ground offensive against Hamas to 23 soldiers that have now been killed in action. The Israel Defense Forces have been facing resistance as they move into urban centers, and the war in Gaza becomes a full-blown urban offensive. And that's not all. Israeli troops and tanks also conducted live fire drills in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights, an area that was once part of Syria until 1967. Israel's annexation of the region in 1981 remains internationally unrecognized, and Syria continues to call for its return. Israel cites concern about Iran, a Syrian ally, seeking a permanent presence on the border to potentially launch attacks. Meanwhile, a second Israeli airstrike hit Gaza's Jabalia refugee camp just this past week, following a prior strike that Palestinian health officials said killed approximately 50 people and injured around another 150. Take a look.
A second Israeli airstrike hit the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza on Wednesday, a day after Palestinian health officials say a separate strike on the camp killed about 50 people and wounded 150 more. This video obtained by Reuters is said to show the immediate aftermath. It wasn't immediately clear how many casualties came in the second strike, but Hamas says that the incidents killed several of the hostages it took in the October 7th attacks on Israeli communities. The Israeli military says the strikes killed 2 senior Hamas commanders, including a ringleader of the October 7th attacks, as well as a Hamas command and control center. Israel accuses Hamas of hiding its weapons and infrastructure in civilian populations, such as tunnels, intentionally endangering civilians. Hamas accuses Israel of genocide. This eyewitness to Wednesday's airstrike says he was praying in a mosque when it happened, and it was a massacre. Meanwhile, Israel's military says one of its soldiers was killed Wednesday and 15 others Tuesday, its single largest loss since beginning its ground offensive. It says this video shows its forces moving through Gaza. The Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas, says more than 8,000 Palestinians have been killed in the war, including 3,000 children. Reuters cannot verify either side's figures.
Meanwhile, today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Tel Aviv. The United States' top diplomat is in the region for the second time in less than a month to push for humanitarian pauses in the Gaza war. He emphasized Israel's right to take all necessary measures to prevent a reoccurrence of the October 7th attack. However, he also stressed the importance of how Israel conducts these actions, particularly in safeguarding the well-being of civilians affected by the conflict initiated by Hamas. He said that Israel must protect civilians in its bombardment of Gaza. Now, Blinken's visit comes after Israel said that its troops had surrounded the Palestinian enclave's biggest city, the focus of its drive to wipe out Hamas. The White House had earlier said that any pauses in fighting should be temporary and localized. It has dismissed calls from Arab and several other nations for a full ceasefire in the war, which is now in its 28th day.
But we're here as we've been and as we will remain in solidarity with Israel. We stand strongly for the proposition that Israel has not only the right but the obligation to defend itself and to do everything possible to make sure that this October 7th can never happen again. To make clear that as long as the United States stands, Israel will never stand alone. Today, in my fourth visit to Israel since October 7th, I reiterated that in all my discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Herzog, the Security Cabinet. I reiterated and made clear our support for Israel's right to defend itself, indeed its obligation to defend itself. That includes through the additional assistance that we've worked with Congress and we're working with Congress now to provide for Israel's defense, as well as for urgent humanitarian needs in Gaza. This right to self-defense, indeed this obligation to self-defense, belongs to every nation. No country could or should tolerate the slaughter of innocents. You've heard me speak to some of the stories that Israelis have experienced on October 7th. Today, we saw additional images, additional footage collected by the Israeli government from video cameras, some the terrorist zone, others in communities that were attacked. It remains almost beyond the human capacity to process, to digest.
Meanwhile, the Israeli army has accused Hamas of fuel theft from Gaza's hospitals. The Israeli army has accused Hamas of stealing fuel from Gaza's Shifa hospital. They claim to possess a recording with an official from the Gaza health system, suggesting Hamas's quote-unquote cynical use of the civilian population. According to Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the Israeli army spokesperson, Iran is supporting and arming proxies to divert attention from the conflict in Gaza. The army remains prepared to respond to any attacks on Israeli civilians, but has come out and said that Hamas is stealing fuel from Gazans. We continue to shed more light on the way Hamas is cynically exploiting the population. Today we have revealed a recording of an official in the Gaza health system speaking to our forces and describing how Hamas is retaining fuel tanks at Shifa hospital, making an explicit use of it for terror and stealing them from the hospital. While Hamas is claiming the fuel in hospital is running out, they are stealing it from the sick and the patients for terror aims. We will continue to expose to the world the acts of Hamas and how they are cynically using the population as a human shield. Well, now the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza reported that in the past day, 196 people lost their lives, bringing the total death toll to 9,227. Among the casualties, there are 3,826 children and 2,405 women, with an additional 2,100 people still missing. Many suspected and feared trapped beneath the rubble. Health Ministry spokesperson Ashraf Al-Qidra mentioned that Gaza's hospitals are facing a fuel shortage, forcing two of them, Al-Shifa and the Indonesian hospital, to rely on smaller generators that can only support intensive care units, incubators, and the operating rooms. And shifting our focus here, in the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces killed 7 Palestinians in overnight raids. 3 were killed in Jenin, 2 in Hebron, 1 in Nablus, and 1 in Kalandia. The military reported an airstrike in Jenin, an increasingly common attack form. It resulted from clashes with Hamas terrorists who threw explosives at Israeli soldiers. Now in Nablus, the Israeli forces demolished the home of a Palestinian accused of a previous shooting attack. Across the West Bank, 37 Palestinians were arrested, with 17 identified as Hamas operatives. These actions coincide with intensified raids during the ongoing conflict, leading to the deadliest period on record in the West Bank, with at least 141 Palestinian casualties. And in the West Bank city of Jenin, the aftermath of an Israeli military operation shows damaged houses and vehicles. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, at least 2 people were killed in this incident. The fighting in Jenin is part of the ongoing battles in Gaza. An Israeli military spokesperson stated that their forces are currently engaged in counter-terrorism activities in the area without providing further details. On the other hand, humanitarian aid-laden trucks have been allowed to enter the Gaza Strip through the Rafah crossing. Meanwhile, ambulances carrying the wounded await their turn to cross into Egypt. And even as we're talking about humanitarian aid, the United Nations launched a $1.2 billion aid appeal to assist the 2.7 million people in Gaza and in the West Bank, including food, water, healthcare, shelter, and more. Now, this comes as the situation in the region has grown increasingly desperate due to massive bombardments. The appeal emphasizes the importance of adequate funding, access to those in need, and a sufficient flow of humanitarian supplies. The conflict was triggered by Hamas's actions, with Israeli officials reporting over 1,400 casualties, while the Gaza Health Ministry says more than 9,000 people have died, mainly women and children. Fresh Israeli strikes resulted in further casualties in Gaza.
As the crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory continues to worsen, we and our partners will release an updated flash appeal on Monday, the 6th of November, covering the remainder of the year. The cost of meeting the needs of 2.7 million people, that is the entire population of the Gaza Strip and 500,000 people in the occupied West Bank, is estimated to be $1.2 billion. The original appeal, launched on 12th of October, asked for $294 million to support nearly 1.3 million people. The situation has grown increasingly desperate since then. The revised flash appeal will outline the needs for food, water, healthcare, shelter, hygiene, and other urgent priorities following the massive bombardments in the Gaza Strip. We urge donors to promptly make resources available for the response. Our ability to ease the suffering of the Palestinian population will depend on adequate funding, safe and sustained access to all people in need wherever they are, sufficient flow of humanitarian supplies, and, importantly, fuel. It will also depend on protection and assurances given by the conflict parties to the private sector and NGOs to operate. The opening of Israeli crossings will be paramount.
Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden has expressed the need for a pause in the conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza after he was confronted by a protester calling for a ceasefire at a campaign fundraiser. He mentioned that a pause would allow time for the release of hostages held by Hamas since their attack on Israel on the 7th of October, which resulted in casualties and hostages. The White House clarified that when Joe Biden mentioned a pause, he was referring to the hostages held by Hamas since their attack on Israel. The White House has previously expressed support for a humanitarian pause to facilitate aid deliveries to Gaza and the release of hostages. But there's another problem in Gaza. In Gaza, the ongoing conflict has further worsened the already dire state of the Palestinian economy. Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel are part of a single market under the 1994 agreement. However, many Palestinians have to piece together their incomes from various external sources. Surprisingly, around 70,000 Gazans are still on the payroll of the Palestinian Authority, despite their officials being expelled from Gaza by Hamas in the year 2007. And these individuals do not actually work. Entire neighborhoods in Gaza have been devastated by bombings, leaving the population cut off from essential resources like food, water, and medical supplies. The UN has warned that Gaza's 2.3 million residents are on the brink of a severe humanitarian crisis, with the conflict depleting nearly every source of economic life in the territory. Meanwhile, ahead of Friday prayers, Israeli forces patrol the streets of Jerusalem's Old City. Worshippers are expected to gather at Al-Aqsa in the Old City to hold prayers every Friday. As the conflict between Israel and Palestinian Islamist group Hamas in the Gaza Strip deepens, the forces of Israel are patrolling the streets in Jerusalem's Old City. The compound is Islam's third holiest site after Mecca and Medina, and the most sacred to Jews, who refer to it as the Temple Mount. It also holds great significance for the Christians because they believe, well, Jesus Christ roamed these very lands. But amidst all of this, a glimmer of hope. Ambulances transport injured evacuees from Gaza to Egypt through the reopened Rafah crossing. Under a deal that was reached between Egypt, Israel and Hamas, and that was brokered by Qatar, a number of foreigners and critically wounded people have been allowed to leave the besieged territory.
Ambulances transport injured evacuees from Gaza to Egypt on Wednesday through the reopened Rafah crossing. Under a deal reached between Egypt, Israel and Hamas, and brokered by Qatar, a number of foreigners and critically wounded people have been allowed to leave the besieged territory. Egypt has prepared field hospitals in Sheikh Zayed in the Sinai. An Egyptian security source said the deal allowed up to 500 foreign passport holders to pass through Rafah on Wednesday. But there was no link to the release of about 240 hostages held by Hamas, or to a humanitarian pause in the fighting, which many countries have called for, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected. Fathi Abul Hassan, a US passport holder, has been in Gaza for 3 months.
No water, no food, no shelter, nothing. We open our eyes on the dead people and we close our eyes on dead people.
Humanitarian trucks of aid also rumbled through. It wasn't clear how long the crossing would remain open for evacuations. Israel sent its forces into Hamas-controlled Gaza following weeks of air and artillery bombardments, in retaliation for a deadly attack by the Islamist group on southern Israel, which killed about 300 soldiers and some 1,100 civilians on October 7, Israeli figures say. According to Gaza's health ministry, more than 8,700 Palestinians, many of them children, have been killed since then in Israel's airstrikes. The civilian death toll and desperate conditions in Gaza have caused global outcry. Food, fuel, drinking water and medicine are running short, and hospitals are struggling to treat casualties.
Now, Be'eri, which is a kibbutz in southern Israel, lost around a tenth of its population in the October 7th attacks. The survivors have been evacuated from what is now a closed military zone, but at a Dead Sea resort, away from all the rocket fire. Therapists are assisting them in their recovery.
Portraying the dead from a time before their world fell apart. Just one of the therapies helping these people process their trauma at this upscale resort on the Dead Sea. It's a place of relative safety in a country at war. Around 1,000 Israelis who escaped the massacre at kibbutz Be'eri were evacuated here, where they'll live for at least the next few months, and try to come to terms with what happened.
Yeah, in 6:30 in the morning, something like this, we heard a lot of bombs and we woke up.
Ella Ben-Ami recalls the moment the ordeal began. Her parents soon texted her from their home up the street. They were in hiding. Hamas gunmen killed more than 100 people in Be'eri that day. Ella feared her mum and dad were among them.
Something like an hour later, I saw a picture of them on Telegram with both terrorists they took them. It's not in Israel, I guess it's in Gaza.
2 weeks later, Ella found this video on Telegram showing her captured mother, filmed by Hamas. So, looking for clues of where they might have been taken, she and her sister went back to their childhood home.
Why? I can't even describe it. It was so hard. Even yesterday when I went to there. I couldn't step on the ground because on every piece of ground I saw bodies, and I couldn't think of walking on that road.
Donations from across the country have been pouring in for people who escaped with only the clothes on their back.
They have to tell it over and over again.
Dina Draw is one of a team of psychotherapists stationed in the hotel to help them. She says the most important thing is to get people talking.
How they couldn't breathe, how they had no food, how they were worried, how they saw in the WhatsApp group that people are in danger, how they escaped, what did they see. They have to repeat it over and over until the story has a narrative. It has a beginning, middle, and an ending.
She says for Israelis, this was an event unlike anything in recent memory.
It's a collective grief. It's something we don't see usually in Israel. You have a terror attack and a soldier is dead, but here, because of the massive numbers, we have a collective grief. And it's also a strong thing of a community, that they're going through it together.
Going through it together, but each alone in their pain.
There isn't a family that didn't lost someone. There isn't a family here. All the families lost someone. And even as a kibbutz, we are a big family together. And even I lost friends and neighbors, and everyone lost someone.
The 7th of October was traumatic for all Israelis. And even as the people from Be'eri try to heal, it's clear their trauma will be felt for generations.
Well, next up, news from back home. How the Israel-Hamas conflict is actually, the ripples are being felt back here in India as well. Take a look at this. The CPIM has stirred up a hornet's nest in the United Democratic Front alliance by inviting India Union Muslim League, the IUML, for its Palestine Solidarity event in Kerala. The IUML will take a decision on its participation in the event on Saturday. The Palestine Solidarity event, organized by the CPM, will be inaugurated by Kerala Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan at Kozhikode on the 11th of November. Now, just yesterday, senior IUML leader E.T. Mohammad Bashir said that they would attend if CPIM extended their invitation to the party. Now, responding to this, Kerala Pradesh Congress Committee President K. Sudhakaran said that the UDF had taken a decision not to associate with the CPIM, and it was applicable to everyone. Congress sees the CPIM's move as part of their repeated attempts to woo the IUML. PMA Salman, IUML State General Secretary, confirmed on Friday that they received an invitation from the CPIM for the event. He said that they would make a decision on attending the event on Saturday. However, he added that the situation was different from the time when CPIM organized an event on the Uniform Civil Code. Earlier, IUML had stayed away from the seminar on UCC organized by the CPIM. Now, Kozhikode's District Secretary of CPIM, P. Mohanan, said that extending solidarity to Palestine could not be seen as an issue of CPIM or IUML alone. It is time to stay together, he said. He, however, added that the Congress was not invited so that they need not repeat their pro-Israel stand. Taking a look at some other international stories. Pakistan ordered Afghan migrants to leave Pakistan, and this has created a chaotic situation. 10,000 Afghans are crossing daily into Afghanistan from Pakistan, even after the deadline of November 1st, as reported by the NRC Aid Group. Now, NRC Advocacy Manager Becky Roby said authorities and humanitarian agencies were working 24 hours a day to process what she described as a quote-unquote staggering number of people. The Taliban-run administration in Afghanistan is setting up temporary transit camps to cope with the sudden influx. However, relief agencies are reporting dire conditions from Afghanistan. Pakistani authorities have been rounding up undocumented foreigners, most of them Afghans, hours before Wednesday's deadline. More than 1 million Afghans face an uncertain future. The Pakistani government has brushed off calls from the United Nations, rights groups and Western embassies to reconsider its expulsion plan. Pakistan blames Afghans for militant attacks, terrorist attacks and crimes that undermined their security. And next up, according to a report in the New York Post, US intelligence has gathered information suggesting that Russia's Wagner group is making preparations to supply an advanced air defense missile system to Hezbollah, particularly in light of the recent clashes between Hezbollah and Israel. American officials are actively monitoring discussions between the Wagner Group and Lebanon's Hezbollah with a focus on the potential delivery of the SA-22 system. Now, the SA-22 system, also known as the Panzer S-1, is a mobile anti-aircraft missile and artillery system from Russia designed to defend against airstrikes. The SA-22 system, also known as the Panzer S-1, is a Russian-made mobile surface-to-air missile and anti-aircraft artillery system that can be mounted on various trucks. It has been used in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and could potentially be deployed in the Middle East by Iran-backed militia groups to defend against Israeli airstrikes. Meanwhile, in a dramatic turn of events, thousands of people flooded Pakistan's main northwestern border crossing as they desperately seek to cross into Afghanistan. This surge comes just a day after the government's deadline lapsed for undocumented foreigners to exit or potentially face expulsion. Take a look at this report for more.
Pakistan's border was swamped with thousands of people seeking to cross into Afghanistan on Thursday, a day after the government's deadline passed for undocumented foreigners to leave or face expulsion.
We don't want to go to Afghanistan, but these people are not allowing us to stay. My family has been living here for 50 years, but now they are not allowing them to stay.
These people are being very cruel to us. If they'd given us 4 or 5 months more, we could have spent the winter here in comfort. Then, God willing, we would have gone back to our country.
Pakistani authorities began rounding up undocumented foreigners hours before the deadline. More than 1 million Afghans could have to leave or face arrest and forcible expulsion as a result of the ultimatum delivered by the Pakistan government a month ago. The government has brushed off calls from the United Nations, rights groups, and Western embassies to reconsider its expulsion plan. It says Afghans have been involved in Islamist militant attacks and in crime that undermine the security of the country.
The situation at the border points at the moment is completely overwhelming.
Becky Robbie is advocacy manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council.
We're seeing somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 people between both border points crossing on a daily basis. And when people reach the border point, normally they have been traveling already for several days. They've been sleeping out in the open. In many cases, they've had to sell their personal belongings to pay for the transport. They've often left in a very hurried circumstance.
Of the more than 4 million Afghans living in Pakistan, the government estimates 1.7 million are undocumented. Many fled during the decades of armed conflict in Afghanistan, while the Taliban's takeover after the withdrawal of U.S.-led coalition forces in 2021 led to another exodus. Aid agencies warn that the mass movement of people could tip Afghanistan into yet another crisis and have expressed grave concerns about the survival and reintegration of the returnees, particularly with the onset of winter.
Well, next up, news coming in from Japan, where Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has said that the government will spend over 17 trillion yen, which is about $113 billion, on a package of measures to cushion the economic blow from inflation, which will include tax cuts. Now, the government projects the spending plan will boost Japan's GDP by around 1.2% on average over the next 3 years.
Japan unveiled major measures to help ease the pain of inflation on Thursday. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida set out the plans. He said the package would total around $113 billion. It includes temporary cuts to income and residential taxes. Tokyo will also give payouts to low-income households and subsidies to curb gasoline and utility bills.
By putting together income tax cuts and wage hikes next summer, I want to ensure a situation where growth in household income exceeds the pace of inflation.
The government projects the spending plan will boost Japan's GDP by around 1.2% on average over the next 3 years. It said gasoline and utility subsidies will help push down overall consumer inflation by about 1 percentage point. Inflation has hurt Japan's economy and stayed above the central bank's target of 2% for more than a year. But some analysts doubt whether the tax cuts and payouts will help boost consumption and economic growth. One former Bank of Japan board member expects the measures to lift GDP by just 0.19% for the year. Other market watchers believe Thursday's measures could worsen the country's already stretched finances. The spending may force the government to issue more bonds, adding to Japan's public debt, which is the biggest among major economies.
Next up, stories about the big AI boom, from how AI created a new track from the Beatles to big worries over bots on both sides of the Atlantic. We round up the week's big stories from the AI revolution. Take a look.
From why there's a new track from the Beatles to how Joe Biden wants to save the world from chatbots. This is Generation AI. AI is bringing the Beatles back together. Universal Music says a new track from the Fab Four will be released this week. Now and Then comes from an old demo tape made by John Lennon. Before AI came along, it hadn't been possible to separate his vocals and piano well enough to finish the song. Apple unveiled its latest chips, and it's making big claims.
They're the most advanced chips ever created for a personal computer.
Chief Executive Tim Cook says the top-spec M3 Max model is specifically aimed at AI developers who need huge amounts of memory to build chatbots. There were conflicting fortunes elsewhere in Silicon Valley. Microsoft shares jumped after it said demand for AI services helped drive a boom at its cloud computing unit. But growth sagged at the cloud division of Google parent Alphabet, raising investor concern that it's losing out to the Windows maker. Joe Biden is trying to reduce the risks posed by AI. The US president signed an executive order requiring developers to share results of safety tests with the government. That's a step beyond voluntary commitments made by tech firms earlier in the year. And politicians, academics, and corporate leaders gathered Wednesday in the UK for a summit on the same subject. Britain's King Charles recorded some opening remarks for the event.
AI continues to advance with ever greater speed towards models that some predict could surpass human abilities, even human understanding.
Elon Musk and OpenAI boss Sam Altman were among those on the guest list, alongside US Vice President Kamala Harris. But skeptics wonder how much influence London can wield when the US, EU, and China are setting the pace.
Moving on, stories from back home. The Privileges Committee of Rajya Sabha on Friday held a meeting to discuss the breach of privileges case against Aam Aadmi Party leader Raghav Chaddha. Now, the committee has sought a report from Raghav Chaddha by the 7th of November, and the committee is scheduled to hold its next meeting on the 8th of November. Now, Friday's meeting gained significance after the recent Supreme Court remarks on Chaddha's suspension, highlighting concerns about people's right to representation and the seriousness of excluding opposition members based on dissenting views. Moving on, Andhra Pradesh High Court rejected CID's request to monitor N. Chandrababu Naidu during medical bail. The court maintained the stipulations it had initially imposed, but it clarified that interim bail has been granted on health grounds and should not be likened to custodial bail. The CID Council had moved the court to monitor Chandrababu Naidu on his interim bail on the grounds that he was violating his bail conditions. Now, Naidu's arrest last month triggered political turmoil and led to violent clashes. Party leaders condemned Andhra Pradesh Chief Minister Jagan Mohan Reddy's government for the quote-unquote an alleged witch hunt. And take a look at this. As the Lok Sabha polls for 2024 draw closer, several leaders and celebrities are weighing their options of putting the hat in the ring. The latest among these is Bollywood actress Kangana Ranaut. Kangana Ranaut, while being on a religious visit to Dwarkadhish temple in Gujarat, hinted at a possible entry into electoral politics. Asked if she had any plans of contesting the next Lok Sabha elections, Ranaut replied, and I quote, "If Lord Krishna blesses me, then I will fight," unquote. Now, Kangana Ranaut also talked about the BJP-led union government's works and highlighted its role in the consecration of Lord Ram's temple in Ayodhya. And just like we promised, stories about climate change coming up next. First and foremost, to the national capital of India, which continues to be the most polluted city in the country over the last 5 years. Just few days before Diwali, the national capital in Delhi and the entire national capital region is currently grappling with rising levels of air pollution, as air quality in Delhi NCR has now reached the severe category. The Delhi government has imposed the Graded Response Action Plan Phase 3 to combat the air quality as the AQI crosses the 400 mark. Furthermore, public and private primary schools are going to be closed for 2 days, and all construction and demolition activities have been strictly prohibited in the entire Delhi NCR region. Meanwhile, in Gurugram, the district magistrate has imposed Section 144 in response to the escalating air pollution. Meanwhile, even as this graded response plan has been employed, there is politics behind a smog tower in the national capital. Delhi's Environment Minister Gopal Rai criticized the central government for the non-cooperation of the Connaught Place smog tower amid severe air pollution. The tower, managed by the Delhi government, became operational in 2021, but under the new DPCC chairman Ashwini Kumar, the study was halted, causing the tower to stop functioning. As per WHO, Delhi air pollution has spiked up to 100 times the limit. The air quality index reached alarming levels, leading Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal to close all primary schools for 2 days. Despite government efforts, including smog towers, the situation persists, posing significant health risks to city's 33 million residents. Immediate action is crucial to tackle this ongoing environmental crisis. This alarming situation has also resulted in the rift between the central and the state government. Listen in to how the state central leadership are blaming each other over this particular lock on a smog tower and Delhi's air pollution crisis.
ये है दिल्ली का स्मॉग टावर, जिस पर 22 से 23 करोड़ रुपए दिल्ली सरकार ने खर्च किए थे और कहा गया था कि ये दिल्ली का स्मॉग टावर जो है वो प्रदूषण को कम करेगा। आज दिल्ली गैस चेंबर बन चुकी है। अलग अलग जगहों पर 700 से ज्यादा भी AQI पहुंच चुका है। जहां पर हम खड़े हैं कनॉट प्लेस में, बाबा खड़क सिंह मार्ग के पास, वहां पर लगभग 550 तक AQI पहुंच चुका है, परंतु दिल्ली के स्मॉग टावर पर ताला लगा हुआ है और ना ये दिल्ली का स्मॉग टावर चल रहा है। और दिल्ली की पूरे प्रदूषण लड़ने की व्यवस्था का भी यही हाल है कि ताला लगा हुआ है 8-9 वर्षों से। आज अरविंद केजरीवाल जी की सरकार को बताना चाहिए कि दिल्ली वासियों को और उनकी सेहत पर इस प्रकार का जो खतरा आ चुका है कि सांस लेना भी बहुत ही खतरनाक बन चुका है, बाहर जाना खतरनाक बन चुका है बच्चों के लिए, बुजुर्गों के लिए। ये इसलिए हुआ है क्योंकि अरविंद केजरीवाल आम आदमी पार्टी ने 8-9 वर्षों में कुछ नहीं किया है। पहले कहते थे पंजाब की पराली जिम्मेदार है यहाँ के प्रदूषण के लिए। पंजाब में आपकी सरकार आ गई, 750% पराली जलने की घटनाएं बढ़ चुकी है। आप बायो डिकम्पोजर की बात करते थे, 23 लाख रुपए का डिकम्पोजर बना और 23 करोड़ रुपए का विज्ञापन दिया। कहां है वो बायो डिकम्पोजर? पंजाब की पराली आज भी क्यों जल रही है? दिल्ली के जो मुख्य कारण है प्रदूषण के, वो दिल्ली के भीतर ही है। मतलब कि रोड डस्ट की स्वीपिंग कराने वाले थे, MCD भी आपके पास है, कोई स्वीपिंग नहीं हो रही। कंस्ट्रक्शन का डस्ट, उस पर क्या कार्रवाई की गई? इंडस्ट्रियल पोल्यूशन, उन पर क्या कार्रवाई की गई? व्हीक्यूलर पोल्यूशन, आप 11,000 बसेस लाने वाले थे, कहां है वो बसेस? एक तरफ केंद्र की सरकार पूरी सहायता कर रही है, ईस्टर्न वेस्टर्न पेरिफेरल एक्सप्रेसवे बना, फ्लाईओवर बनाए गए, मेट्रो दी गई ताकि पब्लिक ट्रांसपोर्ट बढ़े, ताकि ट्रक्स जो है वो बाहर से निकले, दिल्ली में अंदर ना आए। पर दिल्ली की सरकार को जो करना था उन्होंने एक भी चीज नहीं की है। और आज ये बंद पड़े स्मॉग टावर की तरह ही उनका पूरा पोल्यूशन से लड़ने का प्लान भी ठप और बंद पड़ा हुआ है। केवल दोष किसी पर डालना, कहीं केंद्र पर दोष डालना, कहीं हरियाणा सरकार पर, कहीं उत्तर प्रदेश सरकार पर, और दिवाली आने पर हिंदुओं पर और फटाकों पर दोष डालना, यही उनका एक स्टैंडर्ड ऑपरेटिंग प्रोसीजर बन चुका है। और आज इसीलिए दिल्ली वासियों को इस प्रकार के हैजर्डस मास्क पहनकर निकलने पड़ रहे हैं, क्योंकि अगर ऐसी हवा में बिना मास्क के निकलोगे तो आपके फेफड़ों पर, आपकी सेहत पर इसका क्या असर पड़ेगा आपको पता चलेगा। इसीलिए आज दिल्ली की सरकार जवाबदेह है कि 8-9 वर्षों में उन्होंने प्रदूषण को मुक्त करने के बदले दिल्ली को गैस चेंबर युक्त बना दिया है।
स्मॉग टावर को लेकर के 2 बातें मैं आपसे कहना चाहता हूं। सुप्रीम कोर्ट के निर्देश के अनुसार दिल्ली के अंदर 2 स्मॉग टावर स्थापित किए गए थे। एक स्मॉग टावर आनंद विहार में, जिसकी जिम्मेदारी सुप्रीम कोर्ट ने केंद्र सरकार को दी थी, सीपीसीबी को और केंद्र सरकार को। दूसरा कनाट प्लेस में, जिसकी जिम्मेदारी डीपीसीसी को दिल्ली सरकार को दी गई थी। दोनों सरकारों ने दोनों जगह पे स्मॉग टावर शुरू किए। स्मॉग टावर शुरू करने के बाद दिल्ली सरकार की तरफ से कनाट प्लेस में स्मॉग टावर शुरू हुआ। स्मॉग टावर अपना काम कर रहा था। 2 साल के लिए उसे काम करना था। 2 साल काम करके अपनी रिपोर्ट सबमिट करनी थी और उस रिपोर्ट पे सरकार को निर्णय लेना था और सुप्रीम कोर्ट को उसको रिपोर्ट को देनी थी। केंद्र सरकार का आनंद विहार का स्मॉग टावर के बारे में केंद्र सरकार बताएगी। दिल्ली के अंदर जो कनाट प्लेस में स्मॉग टावर जो हम लोगों ने शुरू किया, वो स्मॉग टावर काम कर रहे थे। उसकी एक पहले भी रिपोर्ट आई थी, जिसमें हमने जो उस समय जो स्थिति थी, उसमें 1 किलोमीटर के दायरे में उसका इम्पैक्ट उतना नहीं आ रहा था, आधा किलोमीटर 500 मीटर के दायरे में आ रहा था। लेकिन फाइनल रिपोर्ट आनी थी 2 साल बाद। दिसंबर में डीपीसीसी के चेयरमैन अश्विनी कुमार जी बने और जैसे उन्होंने रियल टाइम सोर्स अपोर्समेंट स्टडी को बिना सरकार के सूचित किए, बिना कैबिनेट के निर्णय के बंद कर दिया, पेमेंट देना बंद कर दिया, उसी तरह से स्मॉग टावर के लिए जो आईआईटी बॉम्बे और जो अलग अलग एजेंसियां मिलकर काम कर रही थी, उनका जो है पेमेंट बंद कर दिया और वो स्मॉग टावर जो फर्दर काम कर रहा था, उस स्मॉग टावर काम करना बंद कर दिया। और वो स्थिति जो है, इसको लेकर के उसके बाद से स्मॉग टावर बंद पड़ा हुआ। 2 साल के अंदर उनको अपनी रिपोर्ट सबमिट करनी थी। आगे स्मॉग टावर वो एक्सटेंड होगा, आगे वो मल्टीप्लाई होगा, इसका निर्णय सरकार को लेना था। कैबिनेट को बिना कोई रिपोर्ट सबमिट किए, बिना कैबिनेट के निर्णय के ही स्मॉग टावर डीपीसीसी के चेयरमैन ने अपने ही निर्णय पे उसको बंद कर दिया, पेमेंट देना बंद कर दिया, तब से बंद पड़ा है।
Meanwhile, the Haryana government is dealing with the pollution problem with a heavy hand. Acting against stubble burning offenders, the Haryana government issued a total of 939 challans and imposed fines of over 25 lakh rupees until the 31st of October. In an official statement, the state government said that it was working towards completely eliminating incidents of crop residue burning in the state. It also informed that the authorities were able to achieve a 38% reduction in stubble burning incidents during this year's harvesting season in comparison to last year's figures. And in the latest about climate change, a wildfire raged near the coastal town of Gandia in Valencia in eastern Spain. The wildfire compelled the authorities to order the evacuation of at least 350 people. According to emergency services, strong winds hampered efforts to tackle the flames from the air as more than 35 crews battled the blaze near the village of Montichelvo. The regional government has asked for help from the military emergency unit as firefighters from the entire region were drafted in to tackle the blaze. And with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Top Stories. This is Kabir Naqvi signing off. Lots more continues right on the other side. Don't go anywhere.
GPT. It can generate codes and human-like responses through text, write stories, and do a lot more.
I work in a newsroom with anchors, research